Hello, my name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Today, I'll be talking to Tricia Matson, the chairperson of the ASOP 41 Taskforce and a longtime Academy volunteer. Tricia, welcome to Actuary Voices.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Tell me a bit about yourself, why you became an actuary and what you like most about your work.
So probably for a common reason, I was good at math is how I became an actuary. I worked in a bunch of different roles, primarily in consulting. And something that I really like about the jobs I've had as an actuary are the problem solving component, of course. I think a lot of actuaries are attracted to that, but I really enjoy consulting because you get to work on a lot of different types of problems with a lot of different people. And so I get a lot of satisfaction out of solving a problem for someone.
You're right. Being good at math is regularly cited on this podcast as being a reason for becoming an actuary. Tell me, Tricia, you've been a volunteer with the ASB for a few years now. How did you get involved there?
Yes. I was recruited very early in my career, and it was definitely unexpected. I just happened to have a relationship with someone, Godfrey Perot, who was on the board at the time, and he asked if I would be interested, and it was a fantastic experience.
Yes, and it clearly continues to be, as you are still a stalwart volunteer. You currently chair the ASOP 41 Taskforce, redrafting the actuarial standard of practice that deals with actuarial communications, a vital cross-practice standard. This is a substantial piece of work, but you've got some history with ASOP 41, don't you?
Sure. So I actually was on the ASB when it was first drafted. And the reason it was important was because it's very hard for our users, users of actuarial work, to understand what we do. It's just very technical and complex. And so the goal of the standard really was to make sure that there was appropriate transparency to users of our work so that they used it properly, that there wasn't misunderstanding or inappropriate misunderstanding. And it's very tricky to write a standard on actuarial communications that works in all situations because there's so many different ones. And of course, the board tried very hard to consider a wide range of circumstances. But because it was new, what happened is, it was put in place. And of course, actuaries, are reviewing it and doing what they can to follow all the guidance. But once it's actually in use, things are identified that maybe could be clearer. So that's really what's happened is that, as actuaries, maybe didn't have enough disclosure, as the ABCD looked at specific cases where there was concerns about whether an actuary was following ASOP 41, and also because of feedback that went to the ASB decided that it was time for a refresh, which I think was a very smart decision. Once you have some actual practice, you can certainly do a much better job writing a standard. And so our task force was given a set of criteria or areas that feedback had come in that it was confusing. And so we worked pretty hard to try to add more clarity to the standard.
So you're saying that the ASB decided to review this ASOP after a fairly short period of time because they received a lot of feedback about it, looking for clarification about various parts of it.
Yes. What does this mean? Right. How do I apply this? Yes, exactly.
Could you tell our listeners what goes into a review of an existing ASOP?
So I would say before we even start reviewing it, a lot of work goes into the group that's going to work on it. So, of course, for a standard like communications that is cross-practice, we want to be sure that we have members of the task force from all actuarial disciplines, life, health, P&C, pension, which we did. It's good to have individuals that have a good amount of experience with standards because, they know, how things are written and how one standard might interact with others. But it's also good to have people that don't have a lot of background writing standards because they can be a little bit more of a, like man on the street. to help us make sure it's easy to use, easy to follow. And then we also look at the nature of the work people do. We try to have people that work in companies, people that are consultants, people that are regulators. So just trying to get a broad mix. So that happened initially. And we did have quite a broad mix. And then again, in this case, the driver of the update was from the ASB itself. So we had guidance from them on what needed to be updated. And then we went through the standard. I think, this is typical. We go through, we look at the things that we're trying to update, that we need to update. But of course, once it's open, there's other things that come up. Different portions are interrelated. And so really you end up kind of going start to finish and updating the whole document to try to make it as good as you possibly can. And then, sorry, the most important part I left out. Then it went out for comment. I mean, it goes through the ASB. So we draft it, the ASB reviews it, we get to a point we're happy. And then we want input on that. And so it goes out for comment. We try, this better than I do. We try to make sure members are aware that it's going out, that they, get notification of that. And then the comments now have come in. And so the next step will be for us to update for those comments.
Great. And roughly how long a time does the whole process take, or does it vary depending on the complexity of the ASB?
It varies. This one is long. I think the reason is because it applies to everybody, and it's, we really, really want it to be as clear as possible. So I would say more typical, and I'm kind of basing this on my time on the ASB, more typical is, maybe it takes 9 months, maybe a year for the task force to do the updating. Normally it would then go to the ASB, and in one meeting or maybe two, the ASB would give their feedback. It would, then get updated for that feedback and exposed. In this case, I think it crossed 3 meetings, and that really was because of just how critical the standard is to everybody.
Okay, well, you had a webinar a little while ago, and you had so much content that you didn't get to all the questions that were asked during the webinar. So what we thought we'd do today is pick a few of those questions and get the answers so that anybody who was on the webinar or even missed the webinar, they could go back and listen to the webinar and then listen to the questions or the answers to the questions we have. Does that work for you?
Yeah, fantastic.
Great. Yeah. So the first question, I think, is regarding peer review comments to a co-worker's report, actuarial report. The co-worker is not the actuary's client or employer. And how would that meet the third pillar of the definition of an actuarial communication? Now, to answer that question, I guess you talk about the 3 pillars of the actuarial communication first, and then address the question. Does that work?
Yeah, that's fine. And this issue, well, so I'll just add that I think one of the key things that we changed with the standard was that some of the definitions, because they were confusing. And so we did make changes to the definitions of several things, including an actuarial communication. Now I say we changed it. It is still perfectly consistent with the code of conduct, but we just added some additional clarity into the document to try to help people understand it better. And so the discussion on the webinar had to do with whether a peer review would actually be considered an actuarial communication. So I'll start by saying that an actuarial communication is one that's issued by an actuary with respect to actuarial services. And then if you look at the definition of actuarial services, they have to be provided to a principal the individual has to be acting in the capacity of an actuary. And then the work has to involve, advice, recommendations, findings based on actuarial considerations. So you have to kind of work your way through those pillars, so to speak. And I think something that's a little bit confusing about peer review is whether or not it's being provided to a principal. So you could sort of look at peer review as I'm providing a peer review for my coworker. My coworker isn't my client or my employer. A principal is a client or an employer. However, I think if you sort of look more substantively at what the goals are of the standard, really we're trying to make sure that appropriate disclosures occur in terms of the work that's being done. And I would argue that if you're doing work for your coworker, that work is actually for your employer. I mean, that's the reason you're doing the review, is because your employer wants you to. So that's why in the webinar, we identified a peer review as meeting the definition and requiring disclosures for an actuarial communication.
So that means that an actuary has to rely on his or her judgment when they are sending a communication. So if there's back and forth over email about a specific piece of the work, that might or might not be considered an actuarial communication. You'd have to, or would you just wait till the final report and say, yes, this is the complete actuarial communication?
Yeah, good question. Good question. So any individual communication that meets the criteria, again, it's, associated with, actuarial services. So those are based on, actuarial considerations. You're doing the work for a principal. If you're meeting those criteria, each individual communication would meet the definition of actuarial communication. If you had other communications in there that didn't meet those criteria, then you could, kind of take those out of the definition. But the good news is, the standard recognizes that in any body of work you're doing, there's going to be many communications back and forth that could be actuarial communications. So there are, I would say, kind of more minor required disclosures for every single actuarial communication. So you have to make sure they're clear. You have to make sure that the form and the content is appropriate. It has to be, obvious who the responsible actuary is. If there's some significant uncertainty associated with your findings, those need to be disclosed. But beyond that, there aren't required disclosures for the individual communications. And then for a body of work, when you kind of get to the end of it, you, the actuary, can decide what your report is. So whatever set of those communications are kind of the final report. They may be in a pretty bound up report or they may not. Then there's a greater set of disclosures required under ASOP 41 because it's kind of a final communication to your intended user.
Great, right. And you mentioned there, I think, the appropriate form and content. And one of the questions that came in was whether that could be negotiated in advance between an actuary providing the service and their principal. So is there some leeway about the appropriate form and content?
Yeah, so the ASOP certainly isn't intended to get in the way of engagement parameters. So that negotiation, of course, is very important. And in fact, even if the principal kind of, is insistent around minimizing disclosures. I had a real life example where I was presenting to the board and, board materials have to be very succinct. And so it wasn't possible to have all the disclosures under ASOP 41 in the materials. But you can, for example, make those available separately. And I think the key requirement under the standard is if the content is limited, the actuary should be prepared to justify any limitations relative to what is required in ASOP 41.
Got it. Right. Thank you. Are there specific guidelines around the content of an actuarial communication? So could a verbal discussion or a verbal statement be considered an actuarial communication? Or can you, say, for example, develop rates and not provide a written report which includes all the requirements for a communication?
So oral communications do meet the definition of an actuarial communication. So the definition is not restricted to only things that are written or recorded. And there is recognition in the standard that depending on the circumstances, it won't always be possible for an oral communication to include all the required disclosures. But it is recommended that the actuary make kind of a best efforts attempt to provide those disclosures, but certainly they could occur later. I mean, if you're asked a question that relates to actuarial work in the elevator and you have to answer, it's not expected that you can include all the disclosures at that moment. And then just in terms of written report, so there's no requirement to provide a written report in the standard. And it really is the actuary who makes the determination of whether to issue a report. So, the definition of the report specifically says that, that it's what the actuary says comprises the report. And the standard actually gives examples when a report may not be necessary, because again, we have to be practical. We can't necessarily always write one. But again, there is guidance in the standard that says the actuary should be prepared to identify what those circumstances are that might limit either the contents or the fact that you prepared a report at all. And if there isn't good justification, I would say that would likely be a violation of the standard.
Right. As regards to documentation you need to include in a report, say, for example, a principal gave some documents to an actuary before they started work, would those documents need to be included as providing the basis for the final actuarial report?
So there are, I'm going to kind of distinguish an actuarial report from the broader actuarial documentation. And maybe I'll add that was an area where more clarity was needed and added. So the actuarial report, I think you can think of it kind of as the final body of materials that are meant for the intended user to support the findings. So that's something that gets issued. It goes out to your intended user. And the standard has requirements for disclosure, but there are no requirements in terms of which items the actuary puts in that report. It's left to the discretion of the actuary. It should be the items that the actuary thinks the intended user would need to support the findings. There are disclosure requirements in the standard. So you have to disclose information about your assumptions, about any reliance you placed on others, risk, uncertainty. There's a series of disclosures. Separately, the actuary may maintain in their own records what the standard calls actuarial documentation. And that certainly overlaps the report, right? One of the things in your documentation is probably a report, but you may have other things in your documentation. You may have, worksheets, and to your question, you may have materials that the principal provided to you. You didn't create them, but they came from the principal. And there's no requirement for what gets kept in the standard, but the standard does suggest that the actuary may want to include in that documentation enough information so that another actuary practicing in the same area could assess the reasonableness of the work.
Great. Good. Can an actuary specify that they are issuing a communication not as an actuary, but in a different capacity?
So the actuary can do that. And so there's probably two paths if an actuary says, this isn't an actuarial communication or this isn't an actuarial report. So one path is that it's actually not. So if you issue a report or a communication and it doesn't meet the definition in the standard. So for example, you are doing, a talent assessment and it's of actuaries, but you didn't do like actuarial analysis. There's no actuarial considerations. And so if there's no actuarial considerations, then it's not actuarial services, and therefore it wouldn't be an actuarial communication. So in that case, it's fine. You can say it's actually not, and the standard doesn't apply. If the work is actuarial, if it meets the definition of actuarial services, it is an actuarial communication, whether you say it's one or not. So simply saying this isn't an actuarial communication, if it is per the definition, then the standard applies.
Right. Yeah. Let Let me take a moment to remind listeners that you're listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders, as well as friends of the Academy, about what inspires them about their work, both professionally or as an Academy volunteer. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. One of the questions came in was related somewhat to that around personnel matters. So communicating with your boss on personnel issues would not normally be an actuarial service. But if you're communicating on the actual expertise of a subordinate or a colleague, does that mean you're acting as an actuary in that case?
It's a good question. So as is always the case, each actuary has to apply judgment in reviewing standards. So I'm going to share with you my judgment. But again, this doesn't mean it's the rules, because each actuary has to review the facts and circumstances. So the definition of actuarial services talks to, again, this idea of actuarial considerations, and that's not defined. I interpret that as doing some kind of actuarial analysis. So you project something, you make an estimation, you do an analysis that involves like actuarial math. I would not include in there assessing the capabilities of another actuary. To me, that's a little bit more of a personnel type exercise. It doesn't require knowledge of, actuarial math, nothing like that. So I would say that does not fall under actuarial services. But I readily admit that is me making an interpretation that I think is reasonable.
Great. What about record retention? Does the ASOP address record retention? Especially, for example, if somebody is doing some work with the knowledge that it may well be picked up in the next year or in the future by another actuary.
So there's no requirement associated with what needs to be retained or for how long. And again, the main guidance that we see is that the actuarial documentation should be maintained in a form so that another actuary could assess the reasonableness. But again, that doesn't require that you keep anything specific. And it really just says that you should consider that. So if there's some reason why you can't retain the documents, you would not be violating the standard if you did not retain them.
And, well, this is a rather specific one. What about the comments on an exposure draft? So if somebody was giving a comment on ASOP 41 on the exposed document, would that be considered an actuarial communication?
So again, my interpretation for reasons similar to what I described on, reviewing someone's performance, to me, if it doesn't involve any kind of actuarial analysis, actuarial calculations, estimations, then I would not consider it to be actuarial services. So I would say comments on a standard it would not be an actuarial communication.
The Code of Conduct obviously addresses communication as well. And is there any overlap between the proposed ASOP and the Code of Conduct?
There is. And I'll add that that overlap was something that created some constraints in us as a task force trying to improve the clarity of the standard, because the last thing we wanted to do for the users of both ASOP 41 and the Code of Conduct is have definitions between the two that were not the same. So we did very carefully stick to the existing definitions of actuarial communication, actuarial services, and principle that are already in the Code of Conduct. And then added, to the extent we felt we needed more clarity related to guidance, we tried to add on top of that in ASOP 41. So I believe, maybe I hope, that there's no conflict between the two. We tried pretty hard to keep them consistent. I would say the code of conduct covers actuarial communications at a higher level, and then additional details and requirements are present in ASOP 41.
And kind of a follow-up question that I have was that, do you ever hear in comments that people are concerned about an overlap or a contradiction between the code and the ASOP in your experience?
I can't say I hear that often. I don't think it's impossible. And I would say, sort of the code is kind of like the starting point, right? I mean, it's the code that kind of points us to standards. So to the extent an actuary felt there was a conflict, I would point to the code first as kind of overriding guidance that is then clarified through ASOPs. But I guess because the code is definitely very principle based, I don't see much, or nor do I hear much in terms of conflict between the two.
And you'd imagine that it's something that the broader ASB would consider very carefully if such a comment came in, and then make a decision that it did or it didn't, and amend or not as needed.
Yes, I would say yes, that would be taken very seriously.
How about a communication issued by a group of actuaries? Does it matter whether it's one actuary or a group, or do you have that situation where you have a communication issued by a group of actuaries?
Yes, that situation does come up. The standard still applies to each individual actuary, based on their respective role in the communication. And the standard does actually specifically contemplate the possibility that an actuarial communication could be issued by more than one actuary. And it indicates that a joint communication needs to identify all the responsible actuaries. And then those actuaries, each should ensure that their contributions to the communication comply with the standard.
Another question that came in is about actuarial white papers, articles, or other publications. If something has been issued by another actuary as an actuarial communication, is it feasible to rely on it without questioning it too much? Or should one treat it like one would any other piece of documentation and be very quizzical about whether you should rely on it or not?
So reliance is certainly allowed under the standard. And this topic actually is covered in some other standards as well. I would say blind reliance, these are my words, is not allowed. So, the actuary should do enough to make sure that the information they're receiving makes sense based on what they're doing with it. And then on top of that, there's kind of a set of requirements related to reliance in terms of what needs to be disclosed. So if you are relying on methods or assumptions that came from elsewhere, you have options in terms of what you do and what you disclose with respect to those. So if you get an assumption that you are able to evaluate and you think it's reasonable, then you can say that. The current standard actually would also allow you to be silent, but silence implied that you thought the assumption was reasonable. A change we made to this standard was to try to require a more proactive comment that the assumption is reasonable. And then the other options, it certainly will happen where you may get something that you can't evaluate whether it's reasonable. You can state that you didn't have enough information to evaluate whether it's reasonable, or you may be using an assumption that you actually think is unreasonable, but you're still doing the calculation because you're being asked to. So in that case, you simply disclose that you don't think it's reasonable, and proceed and you use it, and then you've met the requirements of the standard.
Another question is one that I imagine occurs a lot for consultants. And it was, what about communications that contain actuarial findings blended with recommended business actions? In particular, where the actuary's recommended business actions are not principally the result of the actuarial finding.
So I would kind of split that into the pieces. I mean, I know you can't actually separate them. They're in the same communication, but the requirements in the standard apply to the actuarial services. So anything that is in that communication that meets the definition of actuarial services should follow the disclosures of ASOP 41. But for example, I would say that if there's cautions on risk and uncertainty related to something you did that is not actuarial services, it's more business consulting, the standard isn't requiring you to comment on that. I mean, you still may want to because it may be wise and helpful to your client, but the standard really does apply to the actuarial components of that communication.
And in issuing the report, would you need to say these sections are actuarial and these sections are not? Or is that the differentiation that's not required?
No, it's not required unless you felt like that was needed for clarity. So, the standard does require that your communication be clear. I would say that as you are trying to meet the disclosure requirements of the standard, if it won't be clear that the disclosure requirement applies to, Section A, actuarial, and not Section B, that's not actuarial, I think you should make that clear in the disclosure. But for some of them, it's probably going to naturally be obvious. I mean, if you're making disclosures about each actuarial assumption, it will probably be obvious that those apply to the actuarial components. But again, if it's not clear, you would have to add clarity because of the requirement to have your communication be clear and have appropriate form.
Thanks. And then I think this may be one of the last questions we have, but how is a recorded actuarial communication different from actuarial documentation?
So a recorded actuarial communication is most types of actuarial communication. So the only thing we're eliminating there is something that was oral and not, voice recorded. And so there is a big difference between an actuarial communication and actuarial documentation. Again, the recorded actuarial communications will, obviously involve things that can be stored. But the actuarial communication is the information that goes to your intended user. And the documentation is more what you're keeping kind of in your records. So that's the distinction between the two. They're going to overlap a lot in most cases, but I would say the big distinction between the two is the actuarial communication is getting issued to an intended user, and the documentation is more what you're retaining for your own records.
Periodically, the Academy issues practice notes, and a lot of work goes into to preparing those. One of the questions we had was whether the actuary or any actuary involved in issuing the practice note, have they issued a communication to the Academy?
So they have issued a communication, and I guess in some ways it's a communication to the Academy. When it ultimately goes out, it's a communication to the membership. I would not call it an actuarial communication. The reason is because in that case, again, this is my interpretation, I would say there is not a principal, because a principal is a client or an employer. And in this case, I would not call the Academy or the membership at large my client or my employer. But all that said, I mean, if there are disclosures required under ASOP 41 that including them would be helpful to the users of the practice note, there certainly are no limitations on adding those disclosures to increase the clarity.
And I imagine that would extend to other documents produced by the Academy, whether they're issue briefs or white papers and so on.
Correct.
It's not just practice notes. Yeah.
Correct.
Well, thank you, Tricia. That's very interesting. And I hope that provides some clarity to the people who listen to the webinar. I want to conclude, if I can. You are one of the Academy's most ardent volunteers. which we referred to briefly earlier. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, apart from being recruited by somebody, what led you to that and what makes you keep going?
So for me, way at the top of my list for what I love about it is the learning is incredible. So there's so many really, really smart volunteers, and it's not just technical learning. So the ASB was a great example because I had to really try to understand what pension actuaries do and what casualty actuaries do. And that has helped me in my career in general. So I've just learned it, or even when I've done something very technical. I mean, I remember when I started as a volunteer, I was maybe 8 years into my career, and I was on these committees with people who, were kind of at the very end of their career. And I just learned so much. So it's a huge learning opportunity. And then, I think most actuaries are, nice people and they care about, doing the right thing. And so I think another huge benefit of getting involved is you just really do feel like you're giving back, not just to the profession, but a lot of what the Academy does in particular is kind of focused on the good of the public. Even ASOP 41, the goal is make sure the people using these reports understand them and that they're not misled. And so a lot of the work really makes you just feel good about helping the little guy, I guess.
Well, Tricia, thank you very much for your time today and the immense amount of time you and the other task force members put into updating the standard. Work that goes on, I know.
Well, it was a pleasure to do this, and thank you so much.
Today, I was speaking with Tricia Matson, Chairperson of the ASOP 41 Task Force. My name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Please visit our website, actuary.org, for a wealth of information about the work that the Academy does. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. And of course, please subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform.